All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Raymond Tran. I'm an associate in the Atlanta office of Cypher Shaw, and I have the honor and the pleasure to welcome you all today and to say thank you to all of you for joining us today for this very special event featuring a globally recognized activist and a member of the Exonerated Five, formerly known as the Central Park Five, and frankly, just a human being who's going to hopefully inspire you to think and to reflect. It's Mr. Powerpost himself, Dr. Yusef Salam, who will be introduced in greater detail and will be sharing his story and insights with us during this event. Have a few quick administrative announcements to make before we kick things off. First off, this event was made possible by the Belonging Project and the law firms of Ogletree Deakin and Cypher Shaw. I would also like to take this opportunity to say a special thank you to Kristen Aquino Pham and Dr. Salam, because we wouldn't be having this event if it weren't for the two of you. So thank you, each of you, for your time and for your trust, and to be speaking with us today on this very important topic. For everyone that is joining us, we welcome your questions during this event. So if you have any questions as the discussion is going, you can submit them to Kristen by clicking that Q&A button on the lower right hand. It should be on the lower right hand corner of your window. So you can type them into the chat, and Kristen will do her best either to integrate it into the discussion or to raise it during Q&A if there's time. If you don't know, there will be CLE offered for this event, and the code will be announced by the conclusion of the event, and a form and additional information will be circulated after the event concludes, so you can keep your eye out for that. And if you're interested in discussions and topics like this, please check out the Belonging Project website, where you can see a host of other events, including ones on effective communication that are coming up. Now, let's kick this off. I'm going to briefly introduce you to the speakers who will be joining Dr. Salam today. So first off, Kristen Aquino Pham, Immigration Associate in the Atlanta office of Ogletree Deacons, mother of three, whose children, I believe, share the same quarantine pod as Dr. Salam. So Kristen raised this idea of having a discussion about criminal justice reform to me early in 2020 and throughout 2020 as the events unfolded. And I told her, absolutely not. I thought it was a terrible idea, because I've taken con law and I've taken crim law, and it's a very challenging discussion to have. You know, is this really my problem if I'm not a criminal defense attorney? Is this really my problem if I'm Asian, right? Where do I even start to have this conversation? But she was very persistent, and just so happened that Tamron Houston, a partner in the Atlanta office of Cypher Shaw, you can Google her, right? She's the head of the A+ affinity group with the firm, but she was asking me about discussions that we should be having as colleagues and as member of the legal profession. And I kept thinking about this conversation topic that Kristen continued to raise to me. So that's how this came to be. So as we were kind of forming the idea, we reached out to Lisa McGann, who is the policy director at the Georgia Justice Project. The Georgia Justice Project is based in Atlanta, and it's an organization that promotes innovation, representation, advocacy, and education for individuals that are in the criminal justice system, and they work to reduce barriers of reentry. And so we will be hearing from her about how the political landscape here in Georgia, while specific to Georgia, is actually a really great reflection of what can happen nationally. And then I decided that we needed to find the best dressed lawyer that I've ever met in Atlanta, so we reached out to Hill. Hill is a litigation partner in the Atlanta office of Cypher Shaw, and again, one of the best dressed attorneys I've ever met. And he brings a very unique perspective because of his experience as an attorney with the power of discretion from his time as a judge behind the bench making decisions, and also as a litigator before the bench. So to all of you, on behalf of the Belonging Project, Ogletree Deacons, and Cypher Shaw, thank you, Dr. Salam, Kristen, Lisa, and Hill, for taking your afternoon and spending it with us. And to everyone joining us, thank you very much. Enjoy the event.
Thank you. Thank you, Raymond. Like Raymond said, my name is Kristen. I'm an associate in the Atlanta office of Ogletree Deacons, and I am so honored to be here today to speak with these experts on criminal justice, on the criminal justice system, and on the need for reform, and also to introduce Dr. Yusef Salam, Dr. Salam is an advocate for criminal justice reform. He is a globally recognized speaker. He has won the Presidential Award from President Barack Obama for the work he's done in criminal justice reform. And he is a father, he is a husband, but very importantly, he has a story that will touch so many of us when we hear it. It has been depicted in media, in the Netflix series When They See Us, in a documentary about the Central Park Five. You might have heard of it through books that he has written. He is an author as well. And he's here today to tell us about his story and also to tell us about things that he's working on and the things that he cares about. So let's just start the conversation. You know, Dr. Salam, we've heard, many of us have heard about When They See Us, or we've read it, we've read what happened to you, but I just think that your voice telling us what happened to you in 1989 is the most powerful tool for us to start with. So can you share with us in your own words just an overview of how you became one of the Central Park Five, now exonerated five?
Absolutely, and thank you for that. First of all, I just want to say I'm honored to be here in front of you. Very rarely do I get an opportunity to interact with people that our children go to school together. So that's really, really cool. In 1989, I was introduced to the world at the age of 15 as a pariah, as the scum of the earth. People basically passed judgment so quickly about what we were accused of that the law didn't apply to us. The law that says you are innocent until proven guilty. People looked at the color of our skin and not the content of our character and passed judgment and said, you know what? We need to bring back the death penalty, is what some of the ads ran in New York newspapers. The former President Donald Trump ran. Bring back the death penalty, bring back our police. And it wasn't 2 weeks after we had gone to trial. It was 2 weeks after we were accused of this horrible crime, a crime that nobody should be accused of if they have not done it. It, for us, was the introduction to what Dr. Malcolm X would call the American nightmare. I mean, I had no idea. My mother used to tell us that she was raised in the Jim Crow South. And I'm looking around and I'm like, what is she talking about? Like, we're in New York. Like, first of all, I didn't know what the Jim Crow South really was. But then I'm like, this is New York. Like, cops are walking around the street saying hi to everybody and all of this great stuff. And I'm thinking that this is a friendly environment. This is the place where you can dream that impossible dream. But when you have skin the color of mine, in the communities that we come from, there's a seed that has been planted there. And that seed is a seed that says you're going to be dead or in jail before you reach the age of 21. And the worst part about it is that when people believe that, they begin to move in their lives as if they were a mistake. The worst part about it is this: to grapple with the choice when you understand conditions that you are facing in America, to grapple with those choices makes you really, really understand what Dr. James Baldwin said when he said, to be a person of color and relatively conscious in America makes you in a state of rage almost all the time. He went on to say that to be African American is to be American without privilege and to be African without memory. Because most people who are on these shores did not immigrate. Most Africans on this continent did not immigrate here. They were brought here and made into chattel slaves. And as we examine that, we look at the 13th Amendment. We know that slavery was abolished in this country. But then we look at the 13th Amendment and it says very clearly, so much so that I wrote it in my book with Evie Zaboy, Punching the Air, African American too. I said, while we talk, shout, whisper, Imani writes on her poster board, the 13th Amendment. Then she writes some more words. Dr. Benu nods. Y'all should know this, he says. Y'all should really understand this. Constitution of the United States of America, 13th Amendment, Section 1. neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Section 2, Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. I'm going kind of around in circles and trying to describe how I became known as one of the Central Park Five, because the how is that we were seen as guilty, and the system thinking that we were the ones who did it. They 13 years later, when the truth came out, and then another 12 years after that, as we fought to get some type of financial compensation in our case, they began to really shaped our story in such a way that made people think that this was just an anomaly. This is not business as usual in America. This is not the way the criminal justice system works. We've heard it being described as the criminal legal system. Most folks know that I call it the criminal system of injustice. I work with the Innocence Project. And if you've been following some of the cases, there's been human beings who have been found innocent after doing upwards of 4 decades in prison for crimes that they hadn't committed. This one gentleman that just came home, I think he is 80, he's in his 80s, and he went to prison when he turned 15 as well. And so his case vibrated with me very differently. But the real collateral effect of getting it wrong is that the real criminals often are out there committing more crime. That's what happened in the Central Park jogger case. The person who raped the Central Park jogger, the person who left her for dead, he was out there committing more crime because in his mind, he got away with the perfect crime. He thought he got away. And so he went on to continue his crime spree. One of the last victims he raped, he also murdered. She was a young pregnant Latina woman. And I specifically lift her up in my speeches all the time because I want people to know and understand that she could have been alive today. Had the system said, something is wrong with this case. Raymond Santana is saying at approximately 1700 hours, me and a group of my colleagues began to walk south. And it's not until the Central Park 5 documentary comes out and he looks up at the camera and says, what 14-year-old boy talks like that? That the public realized, how did we believe this false confession? They thought it was a confession. They thought it was real. Every single false statement that was being made didn't match anything that anyone else was saying, nor did it match the forensics of the crime scene. But people bought it. People believed it. And the worst part, like I said, is that in America, we have a huge problem. The problem we have is a problem of color, where the humanity of people are not recognized. Since the beginning, since the inception of this country, when we read in the Constitution, we the people, we weren't considered people. We weren't considered whole people. We were considered 3/5 of a human being. And I think it's on that premise that our rights continue to be trampled upon, that it creates the atmosphere for a Central Park 5 to happen. It creates an atmosphere for a Breonna Taylor to happen, an atmosphere for Eric Gardner. All of the people that we know about and we don't know about. It creates the atmosphere for a police officer to ride up to a young man named Tamir Rice and shoot him down. I remember when they were talking about Mike Brown, the officer who looked pretty strong to me. He looked like he could handle himself very well. He was describing Mike Brown in a bestial manner, as if he was growing as a monster in front of him. This is where we are. And this is where we have to contend with as we really try to solve this issue. I don't want to call it a problem because the system is not broken. the system is actually operating as it was intended. As I've said many times before, the system is alive and sick. And the call for change after George Floyd was murdered, the call for change was so beautifully articulated by our ancestors' wildest dreams pouring out into the streets and erupting. They didn't say we want reform. They didn't say we want Band-Aids. They said we want abolition. They said tear it down. Because what they knew was that as we pay our tax dollars, legally, no taxation without representation. As we pay our tax dollars, and some of that money is being taken and placed into the police fund, and some of it is taken and placed into the city fund, and some of it is taken and placed here and placed there, we're paying for the people that are trampling upon our rights. So, I mean, I know it's a lot that I'm saying, but I don't know if we have a longer than the time we have, but, you know, when I think about this issue, it's not, I am a survivor in this, but my surviving this particular atrocity, I truly believe, is so that I can tell people what is going on from the inside out. A lot of times we see the issue, we want to attack it, but on the people who are on the inside who really understood that there's a war going on, and the war is the how do I say this, the meaning, not the meaning, this war that we are fighting. My mother, those of us who've seen When They See Us, I'll say it this way. Those of us who've seen When They See Us, they saw my mother come into the interrogation room and get me out of the clutches of the enemy. I never made a written confession. I never made a videotape confession. Thank God, because of my mother. I had a moment with her. She never took me home. She never was allowed to, but it looked like that happened. But I had a moment with her, and in that moment, my mother gave me perhaps the greatest lesson that I could ever be taught. She first told me, stop talking to them. And then the second thing she told me was, they need you to participate in whatever it is that they're trying to do. Do not participate, she said. Refuse. And so in the spirit of not participating, we have to realize our greatness. In the spirit of not participating, we have to realize that we were not born a mistake by the color of our skin. We have to realize this in such a way that it allows us to vibrate at a higher level and refuse to have our rights trampled upon. Not in a way that causes us to be at war, but in a resilient way similar to what Dr. Martin Luther King did. Sometimes we have to pull at the heartstrings of a people, but sometimes the people that we are trying to talk to have no heart.
Well, that is, and we appreciate, I mean, the question, you know, how you became one of the Central Park and now Exonerated Five is obviously a much bigger question than just walk us through exactly what happened that day. The fact it is so loaded. And so, you know, that's why we wanted to hear it from you. I want to point out just on, you know, what you talked us through, and what stands out to me is that you were 15 when this happened. You talk about your mother's, you know, parenting of you, trying to parent through the situation. And as a parent myself, that really does stand out to me. And the interesting thing is that as we were preparing for this, we found out that Lisa, who's with the Georgia Justice Project, was actually living in New York in 1989. She was in a very different place in her life. Now, she was a professional. She was working on Wall Street. She often jogged in Central Park, she said. And so Lisa, you know, just sort of in response to Dr. Salam's telling of, you know, his story and how it's impacted him, I'd like to hear from you, you know, what was your reaction to the case at that time? And then how did your feelings and your thoughts about it change over time as you realized, even though it was way later, decades later, that Dr. Salam and the other boys, there were boys at the time, were not the perpetrators?
Wow, I don't even know how to follow that, Dr. Salam. I'm really humbled and honored to be here, and thank you so much for sharing that, Dr. Salam. It will never stop being such a horrendous injustice. And I almost don't want to say anything because there are no words for what happened in the past. I knew you were going to ask me this question, Kristen, and I was trying to think back because it was the 1980s and in 1989, and I bet there are some people on this WebEx that weren't even born then. So I thought maybe I could just talk a little bit about what it was like in New York City in 1989, because it was a very different world. And in the 1980s, there was a crack epidemic going on, and New York City, in many ways, was the epicenter of that. And drugs and crime were in the paper all the time, and really the papers, in hindsight, were scaring people. The press were scaring people. And Reagan was president, and he was out as opposed to helping people that were that were impacted by drugs. He was just criminalizing them. He was sticking them all in prison, which started this horrible proliferation that we now have of so many people incarcerated. And again, the press was really worked up about crime. And so keep that picture in mind, and also keep in mind that New York City at that point too was really two places, or there was the haves and the have-nots. There was Harlem, which was predominantly Black and people of color and poor, and then there was Manhattan. There was Wall Street, which was predominantly white and wealthy. And so you had that going on too. And I think back then, people who were downtown weren't paying that much attention, other than what they were reading in the paper, but they were really just going to work. They were going to work, they were making money, they were coming home. And so I just want to, paint that picture as a backdrop too. And there were so many things that, again, that were horrific and wrong, and about what happened in 1989. But one thing was when the Central Park jogger was attacked, it made the news immediately, and also quite immediately, the police came up with offenders. I mean, it happened very, very fast. So there was this momentum, and nobody asked a question. Nobody said, wow, they're so young, or wow, that happened so quick, and wow, and there wasn't a lot of detail either, in terms of course, nobody knew there was no DNA and there were no confessions, and that wasn't printed. But that's not an excuse. That's just to paint the picture of when. I was also living in New York in 2002 when, everything was overturned and the truth came out. And it was like a light bulb. It was like, oh my God, how could that have happened? And I do think that also in the past, there was more of an obedience to authority. The police said they found the offenders. They're like, oh, okay, they found the offenders. Now, if they had found 5 white young men who were, in polo shirts and had golf clubs, would they have believed they were the offenders? Probably not. But I do think the context of the time is just important for people to know. As I said, some people probably weren't even born back then. But it's, that's my.
That's very helpful. And, we hear, so there's a common theme, and this is kind of why we structure the questions this way. I mean, race played a factor in what happened to Dr. Salam and to the exonerated five, to the boys. And you're both agreeing with that. Dr. Salam is a Black man, Lisa, you're a white woman, and you have seen yourselves how race has played a factor in the criminal justice system. I wanted to ask, one thing that I think a lot of us are dealing with in this reckoning, I guess, that happened in 2020 is, one, are we willing to admit that there is a systemic race problem in the criminal justice system, which, we both are confirming. The second thing, though, is for those of us who weren't sure of it before, who are privileged enough to not know that it existed before, how have we been able, how has that evolution, and I guess this would be for you, Lisa, you've worked now in the criminal justice system, that evolution of realizing that race is an issue, how does that come to be?
Well, now it's awesome that we have so much data, and data doesn't lie, and we can just say, in Fulton County, you're 8 times more likely to be on probation if you're Black than if you're white. In counties in Georgia, you're 7 times more likely to be stopped, for driving on a suspended license if you're Black than if you're white. Like, we have this data now, so it's just so easy to give it to people and say, you're 3 times more likely to be in jail if you're Black than if you're white. Like, there's no getting around it now. Like, you have it, you can share it, and people have to deal with it. So I'm so thankful that we, that we have open records now, that we can get the data, we can show it, we can prove that judges are biased when they're giving sentences, and that police officers are biased, when they stop people. We have the data to prove it now, so it's so in that respect, it's great.
Thanks, and oh, of course, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to chime in just a bit, because the data is important, right? But what I think about all the time is what can we do? What can we do with this information? Because, I remember when the Central Park jogger case was beginning to be litigated again. We were back in court, and we had already lost all of our lawsuits, but we had come out of prison with the indelible scar on our backs, seared into our skin as rapists. And when the film came out, the documentary by Ken Burns, The Central Park Five, the students at Columbia Law started a petition. And when they tweeted us, myself and Raymond Santana were on Twitter a lot. And when they tweeted us, they were like, hey, can you guys share this petition? And let's say they needed 50,000 signatures. They were at 49,999 by the time we even heard about the petition. The students were enraged because the professor, I think she was an adjunct professor at the time, Elizabeth Lederer, who was the assistant district attorney litigating the case, she was teaching law at Columbia. And the students were outraged. What kind of law can she teach us? How was she able to do this? Like, they wanted her fired. And there's a website, I think the website is called thewayback.com, if I'm not mistaken. And somebody had screenshot the website, and then they screenshot like a day after. The previous description in her bio gave her all of these accolades. Elizabeth Lederer did this and that and so forth and so on. And at the very end, as if it was the cherry on top, they said, and she prosecuted the Central Park Five. This is what it said. The very next day, that was gone. And I'm saying that because, of course, in more recent times, she's lost the ability to teach anything at Columbia Law, just like Linda Fairstein has lost the ability to become a multi-million-dollar sex crimes author on the heels of what people thought she did in the criminal justice system. But what they did, which is what I think we have to really examine, is they gave her and they give officers and they give people who trample upon people's rights institutional protectionism. Yes, some people go to jail sometimes, but in mass, we see a lot of slaps on the wrist, right? And I think that part I just wanted to say that real quick, just so that we can understand that data is important, right? The Equal Justice Initiative and the Legacy Museum in in Montgomery, Alabama, they've captured the data. They showed it. You see these huge structures if you've ever been there, and you're trying to understand what you're looking at the lynching memorial, and you're realizing that these are representations of people who were lynched, who may have not even been known, right? But the stories were there. And so they captured the data. And the data, I think the beautiful thing about having the data is that it's shocking, right? It's so shocking when you realize that this is a systemic issue. This is not mistakes. This seems like there's a real huge problem, right? And so the data is needed, but we have to do something with the data.
Yeah, and I just want to add that and we have to do something with the data has to be citizens, corporations, churches, charities.
Yes.
I mean, it's full stop, and that is how you're going to drive change. Not, so that's
It's
anyway.
all of that. Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And that's a good lead-in for Hill, Mr. Hill. He is coming at this from a great perspective, because before he was the best dressed partner or lawyer in Atlanta, say Farth Shaw or whatever Raymond said, he was a judge. He was also in, was it the Attorney General's office?
I was a deputy attorney general, and I was.
Okay, so he was on the law enforcement / judicial side, and I would like to hear, Mr. Hill, like, what are your thoughts on what we've discussed so far, and also, do you agree that race is an issue in the criminal justice system? Is there a systemic racism problem?
I think that in this country in which we live, which has made us a promise of prosperity and a very fruitful life, and we keep living to see that promise come to fruition for us. I think race is an issue in almost everything in life here in the U.S. We talk about the criminal justice system and race being an issue in the criminal justice system. The fact of the matter is, the criminal justice system is just one congregation of institutions we have. Race is an issue in all of our institutions, in banking. It's an issue in healthcare. It's an issue in housing. So when we talk about the criminal justice system, it's difficult to have a conversation about the criminal justice system unless we talk about all of our institutions, because they're all interdependent and they interact with each other. And race plays a part across the spectrum. In some institutions, race is a more weighty element in the equation that results in a determination that's going to influence somebody's life, but it's still an element in the equation, and we have to take that under consideration. What happened to Dr. Salam should never have happened. I mean, he let's just be honest with you. He was a 15-year-old kid. He was not a grown man. He was a 15-year-old kid charged with a heinous crime in New York, and he was being interrogated by experienced investigators. And he had two ADAs who were experienced ADAs, and he, and along with 4 other young boys, not men, young boys. The fact of the matter is that without adequate representation, they basically didn't have a chance. So my perspective on this, I was listening to Lisa. She explained to us where she was in 1989. In 1989, I was a deputy AG. I had run the criminal division for 6 years, and now I was supervising 4 divisions in the AG's office. And it was the year before I went on the bench as a judge. Governor Joe Frank Harris appointed me to the bench. But Dr. Salam's perspective is unique in the sense that it is so different from mine. And what he has to teach us in a conversation with us, we need to listen closely, because Dr. Salam, his experience was my worst nightmare. And when I was in the AG's office, I spent 13 years there. I was 11 years in the criminal division. 6 of those years I ran the criminal division. My last 3 years in the AG's office, I was a deputy. And as I said, I supervised 4 divisions. And I approached my job, and to me, it was a mantra. It was not my job to get convictions. And it was not my job to see that convictions stuck on appeal. It was my job to see that justice was done. And you know what that entails? Slow down and take a look at what's in front of you. Because there's no such thing as stereotypes when you're talking about individual lives. And so when we start talking about reform in the criminal justice system, we're actually talking about reform in all these institutions that provide us services, supposed to provide us protections. One of the things we have to have a serious conversation about, because our institutions are not just buildings. Our institutions are those bodies that occupy those buildings, those individuals who make those decisions. And when we start talking about our institutions, we have to look at the quality and the character of the people who occupy those institutions, who exercise that substantial discretion that can influence the trajectory of somebody's life. And we have to ensure that we put good people in those jobs. We have to make sure that when people lose their way, they are removed from those jobs. So it is a very difficult, because it is a very complex conversation, but it is one we need to have. And I think 2020 has shown us that we have got to have this conversation if this country is going to make good on its promise to all of its citizens.
So true. Dr. Salam, what are your thoughts on that? I know the quality and character, I've heard you talk about something very similar in other speaking engagements. What are your thoughts on Mr. Hill's perspective?
I mean, it's spot on. And, you know, the thing about it is that the worst part is we have, you know, when I think about law, I think about the ultimate lawgiver, right? The ultimate lawgiver is the creator. And so people who follow any religion, any kind of faith, they have a book that guides them and says things like, thou shalt not have any graven images before the creator. You know, you should not steal, you should not rob, you should not murder, you know, vengeance is mine. And, you know, all of these beautiful things that allow us to coexist in a way magnificently. And then you have man, and man makes laws. And in this country, man made law that says slavery was okay. And the worst part about it is that, as we saw early this year, the same concept that we saw in Charlottesville, where people were walking around with tiki torches and they were saying things like blood and soil. They were saying things like states' rights. They were walking around in defiance. And the institutions that were spoken about, the bodies inside of them, the part that's the scariest is that the bodies inside of them are walking around us, enjoying the same liberties that we want to all enjoy, enjoying the same freedoms that we want to all enjoy. But what we've seen is that issue that we haven't yet solved, right? And I forget the exact quote from William Faulkner about the past isn't the past. The past isn't dead. It's not even the past, right? We're still dealing with these things. And the worst part about it is that when an institution can give you a definition of what you're looking at, we turn everything off. It's our duty to be able to see people and see the best in them, right? And what I mean by that is when we see people, we should be able to say, this is a person who, when their mother and father got together, was one of over 400 million options. The fact that they are here in front of us is a miracle. They were born on purpose. And if we know that they were born on purpose, we have to know that they have a purpose. There's a reason. And sometimes the worst part that we can do in terms of the municipalities, and I'm not necessarily talking about from the top level, I'm talking really about the whole thing as it trickles down. Because the worst thing we could do, and I'm talking about things and concepts as like when we look out at life, if you happen to look like me, you're looking out of the window. But if you have the complexion for acceptance, you're looking in the mirror. Life reflects you. But when you look like me, you're seeing other people's lives being reflected and not your own. And what is being told to you is that psychosocially, you don't matter. And psychosocially, we all matter, right? And it's a challenge. The biggest challenge is to try to figure out, as a young nation, right? In America, we're a very young nation. We have the opportunity, those who have immigrated to this country, we have the opportunity to examine the places that we came from and look at what we've done in those places with the criminal justice system, with humanity, with things like healthcare and things of that nature. And we have to figure out in this melting pot, with the kaleidoscope of the human family, how can we become, not just in name, the superpower, but how can we really be that? How can we be the place where people want to come to have their dreams realized? That's what we're talking about. And that restoration is a tremendous feat. But I think what Mr. Hill said, which is so very important, is that when people lose their way, they should be removed. Those individuals should not be dealt with one hand washes the other, both hands wash the face. We protect you. Listen, we're going to have to remove you from Brooklyn and we're going to have to send you to Mamaroneck because no one in Mamaroneck knows you, right? No, we need to be able to, because if the person has a track record, especially with the data, right? The data and the transparency shows now what is going on behind the scenes. Who is it that are there protecting and serving us? What is the records of these people? We want as a people to have the best of the best, period. If it's an officer that found their purpose in life to serve and protect people, then we want them to be excellent at their job. We want them to exemplify what we see on the side of the cop cars in New York City, on top of to serve and protect, are the words courtesy, professionalism, and respect. That is important. That's value and value given. Right.
Very true. And, that, we've established that there is, systemic racism. We're at a point now where we have to talk about race. We've just, we've finally somehow as a country have learned we cannot just pretend race does not exist. And then we've talked about the fact that we need to do something about it. And I think you have all, you, Dr. Salam and Hill, brought up a good point that we need good people in power. And so, Lisa, I'm going off script a little bit. I wanted to direct this to you. Can you tell us a little bit about what the Georgia Justice District is working on with respect to getting the right people into the positions where they can fix some of these issues we have?
Sure. So we're nonpartisan. So it's not that we don't advocate for who gets elected at all. But I will say it is very, very, very important. I don't think people realize. Everyone knows who ran, who ran for senator, federally in Georgia, but you need to know your state senators. You need to know your state representatives. They make all the laws that impact you day to day. They really, really do. And judges, I mean, we vote for these people. And I can't tell you how many times someone will say to me, who should I vote for? And I'm like, you need to do the research. I mean, you can see what they're doing. You can see their voting records. You can see if they're voting for, lifetime probation sentences for people, or they're voting for, probation reform. You can see that. So it's really important that people get very, very involved in their state politics. I mean, great to be involved in federal politics, but it doesn't affect your life day to day like state politics do. So I think that's really, really important. Yeah, we're down at the Capitol every day. We have last year we got the first expungement bill passed in Georgia. People can get misdemeanors off of their restricted and sealed, expunged from their criminal record now. And this year we're working on probation reform. Today we just got a unanimous passage out of the Senate chamber, so that everybody has access to early termination after 3 years serving probation. So hoping that we have the same success in the House and it becomes law. I mean, we don't have a governor that is committed to criminal justice reform. And I agree, Dr. Salam, it's not really great to say criminal justice reform. We almost be better starting from scratch, because all we're doing now is we're trying to reduce the number of people that are incarcerated. That's a really bad place to start. We're trying to reduce barriers to reentry. Like, it'd be so much easier to start with a clean slate, because we're just trying to fix. It's like whack-a-mole. Every year we're trying to fix things that become law and undo so much of the over-criminalization that's happened in the past. But we can change it, but people and Georgians can change it, but everyone's got to get involved to do that. So there's a lot going on downtown. A lot of it is election reform. We care about that, but we're not really involved in that. We're involved in anything that has to do with the criminal law and probation reform. We're working on driver's license reform. We automatically suspend driver's license when people have an inability to pay, and we're working on that. We have a bill downtown on that, and we have those are the two biggest things we have. And we're also trying to weigh in on some of the things that are being talked about that we don't want to see go through. But we have a Republican chamber. We don't have, even though we have 2 Democrat senators on the federal level, we still have a Republican chamber downtown and a Republican governor. So.
Well, and going to your point, Lisa, and this is not a partisan issue at all. The criminal justice, the problems in criminal justice aren't partisan. So I'm saying that to say, I know Dr. Salam is working on things in New York State as well, from what I understand. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because New York State and Georgia, when you think of them, 2 very different states. So tell us a little bit about your initiatives there.
Yeah, so we were successful at passing getting legislation passed where we wanted to have the full custodial interrogations videotaped, because we wanted people to see what no one knows, or no one knew, the citizens didn't know when they were watching confessions, whether they were real or not. All they knew was that this person confessed, and it looked very compelling, right? Even false confessions, as they say, look very compelling. And so we got legislation passed regarding the videotaping of the whole interrogation from start to finish. We're pushing legislation now where we want to make sure that police officers are not allowed to lie to you. I mean, the Central Park Jogger case is the example of that, where they were lying to us, saying, hey, listen, all you got to do is tell us this, we'll let you go home, And as a part of the read technique, when you think about all of that stuff, the process that they use to break a person down. I remember watching a film, oh man, what's the name of this film? It was a film that Denzel Washington was in, a few years ago. And in the film, it was the weirdest thing because, you know, you're thinking about a character like Denzel Washington and what he supposedly represents. And he gets caught almost like as soon as the film opens up. And he gets caught, and I'm like, what kind of film is this? Like, you know, he's supposed to be the main character, and he's caught. And they take him to this, it's called Safe House. They take him to the safe house and they begin to interrogate him. And as they interrogate him, he's, of course, he's not breaking, he's not budging. He's like, you know, I'm not telling you guys nothing. And they look at each other and give the nod, and he realizes what's about to happen. He looks at their equipment. And of course, before I won my lawsuit, I didn't know what he was talking about. He said, that looks like 300 thread count. You need at least 1,000 thread count. I said, thread count? What the heck is thread count? And they start waterboarding him. And he supersedes the time that most people break. And they bring him back up, and he spits the water out of his mouth, mocking them, and says, how long was that? And essentially what he was saying was that if the conditions were correct, I would break too, as an adult. Now we're talking about police officers. One of the great things that Mr. Hill spoke about was the fact that these officers in the Central Park Jogger case were seasoned. But I don't know if the public knows how seasoned they were. These were Manhattan North homicide detectives who could not be, you could not apply to get into Manhattan North Homicide Squad unless you had 20 years on the job. If I was working 20 years on the job, I would be an expert. And I'm saying that because the process, the methodology, like the Central Park Jogger case represents a microcosm of a macrocosm of cases just like us. And so when you begin to look at the can of worms that the officers went after, you know, in their detective work, you begin to see the unraveling of a system that we think is to protect and serve us. And we realize we haven't. I mean, on the heels of the crack epidemic, on the heels of so-called Reaganomics, on the heels of everything, right? And I'm saying that because what's really troubling is when I moved to Georgia, I moved here after Trayvon Martin. And I'm mentioning Trayvon Martin only because of the South, right? He's Florida, this is Georgia. And I couldn't for the life of me understand why was it legal for George Zimmerman to get away with an obvious crime. They were talking about the stand your ground laws. And I thought, coming from New York, like the law in New York is the law everywhere. And I didn't know that wasn't so. Someone told me that when I was in California speaking at USC, they said, make sure you don't jaywalk out here. They will really like give you a ticket and try to lock you up. And I said, are you serious? Like, you can't be a New Yorker unless you jaywalk. That's like a New York thing, you know? Like, we don't wait for the middle of the end of the block. We cross in the middle. You know, we look like Frogger sometimes, you know, jumping out of the way of vehicles. I mean, it's a little comedy, but, you know, at the same time, you know, it just blew me away. I have a lot of family that live in Alabama. My mother was born in Birmingham, Alabama. And to go from Georgia to Alabama, it's like you're going back in time. And I'm saying all of that to say that we have to really, like, when we think about even the chambers, right? If the chamber is Republican, if the chamber is Democrat, there shouldn't be an issue if a person believes from one side of the aisle differently than the other side of the aisle, if we're talking about what's right. Because when we're talking about what's right, right is right and wrong is wrong. And it's really just that simple. But we know that that's not what happens. We know that legislatively, that the process is, well, we will just vote for our people and whatever it is that they put forth just because we're affiliated with a particular party, right? And I think that that part has to be rectified too in terms of party lines, right? We can unite. We can make sure that we are not the divided states of politics. You know, we could be the United States of politics, but we are the divided states of America. We've been the divided states of America. And I think that we are what we're seeing politically, which is really about life, right? Politics is not just in 2, 4, or 6-year increments. Politics is about life. And when people think about it from that perspective, you don't get caught up with personalities, right? We got caught up, I think, when Barack Obama was the president, because he was charismatic, right? He made it look good, right? And then it was like systemically, the people who really wanted things not to go that way, we really saw the tango in action. It wasn't just 2 steps forward, 1 step back. We went all the way back. And now we're trying to climb out of the pile of dirt that we're in, you know? And I mean, legislatively, there's a lot of stuff that's happening. I think the beautiful thing about passing laws and becoming pioneers in that manner is that we get the opportunity to say we did it first, right? And so if we did something really unique and powerful here in Georgia, we get the opportunity to say, look at what we could do. Look at what we did, right? You guys need to get your act together. And that's really what it's all about, right? Showing the way, right? In my book of poetry, I write in the first, in the introduction, I said, you know, I wanted to share this work specifically because I wanted people to know that when you find yourself in so-called dark places, there's always a light somewhere in the darkness. Even if that light is inside you, you can illuminate your own darkness and shine your light on the world. We have what we're talking about, especially from an office perspective, right? The office of the president, the office of the Senate, the office of the state, all of these offices that we're talking about legacy. We're talking about the ability for our children's children to say, I am the child of someone who was great, who did something important. Not, I'm the child of, let's not talk about, you know, that.
Right. Well, and just to kind of tie up this part of the questions, Hill, what are your thoughts? So we've heard about New York, you've heard about Georgia, the need for legislation. I'm curious to know, Hill, what you think about law enforcement and potential potential improvements in that sector, because I know that was something that you worked in. And then also sitting in our fancy law firms, what's our role in all of this from your view?
A news release on a that law made at Notre Dame, I think back in 2019. And Dr. Salam remarked that when he first came into the system as a juvenile, I think he'd been in the system maybe the first 6 months, that an officer came up to him and asked him, "Who are you?" And I think that is a question we need to ask ourselves every day. And hopefully 5 years from now, if I ask myself, who am I, I'll be a better man than I am now. And the reason I say that is because when we talk about these institutions, we talk about the effect of racism. And I keep coming back to this. Institutions are more than just buildings. They're the people who occupy them. Now, this is the problem that we have in this world in which we live in. I'm an optimist. I'm always confident tomorrow is going to be better, but I'm pragmatic too. And I know that although we are God's creatures, we're imperfect. And it is absolutely impossible for imperfect creatures to create perfect institutions. So our lives are a constant exercise in bettering our institutions for ourselves and for our generations to come behind us. So as I look at where we are right now, some of our institutions need more care than others. I agree, law enforcement by and large, because that's one of those institutions that interacts, truly directly with us and has the potential for immediate, devastating impact if it's done wrong. So do I think that we need to stop and take a good look at law enforcement? Yeah, because to me, law enforcement, when we're talking about protecting our citizens and protecting property and ensuring people's lives, it is a totally different concept from engagement in warfare. And I think that it is dangerous to conflate police with military activity. Citizens are not the enemy. So it's a whole different mindset, a whole different set of rules of engagement with the police and the citizens, as opposed to our armed forces and our enemies. And I think that people have lost sight of that. So I think we need to step back and we need to reevaluate. With reference to, law firms, yeah, I do think that unless you have had the experience that Dr. Salim has had, and to a much lesser degree, unless you've been involved in law enforcement and the criminal justice system, to the extent I've been involved, the average citizen does not understand. When I was an undergrad, I worked with I went to law school with two guys from Chuckatuck, Virginia. In my law school, I think there were 13 black guys in undergrad. There were 2 black guys in my law school class, me and a guy named Morrison. Morrison went on the bench in Portsmouth the year after I went on the bench down here in Georgia, and Morrison has stayed on the bench. I had to leave because I had to pay to send my daughters to college, and I couldn't do it on a judge's salary. But Matthew and Bobby came back after the summer. They had worked in a ham processing plant, and these guys would not eat sausage because they had seen it being made. The average citizen has never seen sausage being made in our criminal justice system. Dr. Salim has not only seen it, he's been in the grinder. The most I've been is standing on the side seeing it being made. And as I said, Dr. Salim was my worst nightmare because I did not want somebody like Dr. Salim to have that experience on my watch. And that type of fear or dread ought to wake the average citizen up every morning. And if that happened, they would reach a point 5 years from now when somebody asked them, "Who are you?" They'd be more involved. They'd be more empathetic. They'd be more concerned about who's in positions of authority because they have grown as an individual. And when the individual inside the institution grows, the institution grows.
So true. And I want to leave some room for questions. I haven't received any yet, but if you do have questions in the audience, please feel free to message them to me. So, it's true that those of us who are not have not worked in the criminal justice system, or have not been through the grinder as Dr. Salam has, we don't know what really happens there and all the injustices that happen there. I'm grateful for media like when they movies or series like When They See Us, for example, that show it to us. And so my question though is this, because now I just want to have a real conversation with all of us, not in our roles as our careers, not as lawyers, not as activists, but just as human beings. And the question I wanted to pose to you, Dr. Salam, is about conversations that we need to be having about police brutality, about injustices in the system, about systemic racism. And the question is this: one, in your book Punching the Air, it's a nonfiction with poetry, as a fiction with poetry aimed to middle schoolers and high school students, as I understand. And you are broaching this topic with children. Is it ever too early to talk to our children about systemic racism and police brutality? And then the second question is, what about if that's an uncomfortable conversation, which for some it may be, how do we also have these uncomfortable conversations with adults? Children, is it ever too early? And how do we talk to our adult friends about these issues?
I think with children, So one of the most amazing things that has happened is in the era of electronics, artificial intelligence, all of this stuff, our children operate technology oftentimes better than we do. And I'm a person that taught myself how to open up a laptop, take all of the parts out and reassemble it. I taught myself that, right? It's talked about a little bit in the film When They See Us that I lied on my job application and told them that I knew what to do, but I did know what to do, right? And so I'm saying that because the conversation with children is, my wife always says we shouldn't sugarcoat life because they're gonna get it somewhere. My challenge is to try to articulate it in such a way that we are able to speak the language that they can understand. Because that's that type of care in providing them the outlook. My third eldest daughter, I have 10 children, 7 girls and 3 boys. The third one from the bottom, I'm sorry, the third child from the bottom. I remember when, I think it was Breonna Taylor. I think it was Breonna Taylor who passed away. And I'm saying passed away, that's a humane way to put it. You know, my wife and I saw Judas and the Messiah the other day, talking about Fred Hampton and how one of the people who ultimately ends up committing suicide later in life was told to put something in Fred Hampton's drink. He would go to sleep. And then the guy said, it'd be better that way. Almost as if it was humane, right? We're talking about murder here, right? We're gonna put him to sleep before we do the deed, right? There, man, you know, I'm caught not necessarily emotionally in that space, but in the realization that behind the curtain of life that is being presented to us are very, very ugly realities, very ugly, you know. And one of the beautiful things, if we're willing, I think, is for us to pick up books like Punching the Air. Because Punching the Air, just from the beginning of looking at it, it causes you to say, what's this book about, right? We know based on what Dr. King said, we shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but the truth is that in life, we always judge the book by the cover. It just so happens that this book has some content in it, some really, really beautiful and powerful content. And I think in terms of talking with adults and having those types of conversations, it's a little bit more like walking on eggshells, only because we're talking about a person who is who they are. They're not yet becoming, right? They already are. They're who they are, right? And so the beautiful thing about Punching the Air is that we talk about things like a gentrifying neighborhood as opposed to gentrification. Because if we can conversate about what happens when people come into a community, understanding that there are people here already. There are people who were in that skate park and in that basketball court and used to go to that grocery store, right? These people have to be honored. We can't just come in and plant our flag as if we discovered. That's the story of America, but we have to be more honorable and more noble as we try to correct these types of things. And I say that because the conversations have to happen. Our children will see it anyway, you know. The third youngest child, you know, when she saw it, she said, I don't want to live in America anymore. And it was a difficult night, you know. It was a challenge because where do you go? Right? I've traveled the globe, and unfortunately, some of the experiences that we are experiencing in America is really a global pandemic. Black people are fighting 2 pandemics right now. We're fighting health issues with regards to COVID-19. And then we're also fighting against driving while Black, walking while Black, just being Black, looking at our skin as a weapon. And we could never be unarmed because of that, And so having those conversations, I think, is great, because the younger we have those conversations, the better we will be able to talk about things and talk through things as adults. Because I always say children learn what they learn from somewhere. Either they're learning it at home, or they're learning it in their circles of friendship, or the lack thereof, or they're learning it because they're looking in the mirror and not out of the window like other people don't get the opportunity to.
Lisa Hill, what are your thoughts? Tell us, about your thoughts on those uncomfortable conversations.
After you, Lisa.
I agree with Dr. Salam. I don't personally think it could ever be too early. I think children are born into this world perfect, and then something happens. And that something is so environmental that we should be contributing to what that environment by educating them very early, and helping them navigate the world. And I agree, if we don't participate in that, they'll learn it somewhere. They'll get it somewhere. So I think it's almost like, in many ways, it's you against the world when you're bringing your children up, because you're constantly trying to autocorrect what they're learning at school, or what someone's telling them, and you have to have these guardrails so that they end up where they need to be here. So yeah, I don't think you can ever start too early in that regard. And plus, if it's true, it's life, so I agree.
And adults,
Yeah.
and also, and Hill, you can chime in on this too. Also, those uncomfortable conversations with our neighbors,
Yeah.
our adult friends.
Well, when I was growing up, I grew up here in Atlanta. I had 6 baby brothers and 2 baby sisters, so there were 9 of us. And I never understood growing up why my daddy always wanted us to get it done now. I mean, the worst thing was for him to have a couple of days off work, because he would work us to death. But as I grew older, and I had my own family and my own children, I look back on my experience, and I understand now why my dad wanted, especially his sons, to get everything done now, because he had 7 sons growing up during the Vietnam War era. And he did not believe all of his sons were going to survive the Vietnam War. And the conversations my dad would have with us and with my 2 baby sisters were very different from the conversations I have with my children. My dad's conversation with us was, these are the things you don't do. These are the places you don't go. These are the people you don't talk back to. It was a conversation in understanding the restrictions on social interactions here in Atlanta. Those are not the conversations I have with my children. Although I do caution my 2 daughters that they do have to be careful, because the fact of the matter is, and I've told them this, they're at a substantial disadvantage. I said, your dad, I can grow old, I can get bald, I can have a pot gut. I'm still going to be Black, but the probability of me being successful is much higher than if you get old, you get bald, and you get a pot gut because you're a female. You're a Black woman. Life is not your friend, and time is your enemy. So time may present itself as your friend, sometimes as your ally, but I want them to understand that in all things, time is their enemy. So I do have a conversation with them, and I caution them about not putting themselves in situations where they could jeopardize their own physical health and safety. But I want them to understand that for them, the world is an opportunity. And when they see it, they need to be intellectually aggressive and they need to take advantage of it. So the conversations I have with my children are very different from the conversations my dad had with me. Now, and the ability to have conversations with children is a little bit easier because they're not yet vested. They are, as Dr. Salim said, they are still growing. I mean, they are like little sponges. They soak it up. So you got to be careful what you give them and how you give it to them. When you're trying to have conversations with other adults, with your neighbors, with your coworkers, they're already vested. As Dr. Salam said, they're already who they are. I mean, they have a vested interest in the continuation of certain institutions because those institutions provide their financial well-being. And so they may think you're right on a moral or social basis, but financially they can't agree with you. They can't afford to agree with you. And you know, I remember the election in 2016. I remember watching the returns, and I was watching George Stephanopoulos on TV, and he was paying attention to the exit polls, which tended to show that Hillary Clinton was winning. And then the results started coming in, and Donald Trump was winning. And George Stephanopoulos was so put off by the election polls, he said, we can't trust exit polls anymore because people will tell you one thing, but in that voting booth, they vote the way they talk around the dinner table. And that's what was happening. And that's what makes conversations with your neighbor, your coworker, the guy down the street, it makes them difficult, but it makes them all that much more necessary. You've got to have them. And the fact of the matter is that, you know, I'm a Black man in America. I have got to develop the ability to have difficult conversations with people. That's part of the survival skill. You've got to have it. Now listen to Dr. Salam. He's developed the ability to have difficult conversations with people. He's got to have that tool on his tool belt. And if you've got it, you got to hone that skill and you got to use it.
Thanks, that's so true. I actually do have questions now, and I think I just didn't click on the right tab. One of them is sort of also to the point of having these conversations with other adults. Someone asked if we could hear a bit more about what other concrete changes can be made to better our criminal legal system, such as removing civil forfeiture laws or arrest quotas. Anyone, maybe Lisa, you want to take that from a policy perspective?
Well, there is a bill downtown. Every year there's that bill is downtown and it has not passed yet, but it's there again this year. So
is that to remove the civil forfeiture laws?
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain that? You know what, for me, can you explain what that is?
You know, I guess sorry. No, I was just going to say, I guess I just would reiterate that, you know, and GACTL, the Georgia Association of Defense Lawyers, was really behind that, you know, that changing the civil forfeiture law. But, you know, individuals have to get involved too. I mean, you've got to call your legislators. You've got to make your voice heard. I mean, everybody has more impact than they think, and they know people of impact. You know, those are the conversations you need to have with your adult friends that are running companies and running charities and running churches, and you got to make these calls and make your voice known, because that's the only way we get these laws changed.
And sorry, what is so just for everyone on the call benefit, what is the civil forfeiture law? Like, what is civil forfeiture?
So basically what that means is, well, actually Hill should be answering this question.
Well, you know, for a time, I represented the Department of Public Safety here in Georgia. I represented the State Patrol, GBI, Pardon and Parole, and the Department of Corrections. And for example, I'd be representing the GBI, and there's a high wing Cessna that crashed down in South Georgia. The GBI and the local sheriff's department are racing to get there because it's probably a drug plane and it's probably got a lot of cash on it. And so it depends on who gets there first, and they take custody of the cash. So they've got the cash. They arrest 2 or 3 people who are injured in the crash. They set an extremely high bond for them. They make the bond and they're gone. They're not coming back. So they put up a cash bond. So then you forfeit the bond. And if the local jurisdiction has jurisdiction, the money goes into the profit for the local jurisdiction. If the GBI has got jurisdiction, then the money comes to the state. Now, maybe it's not a plane. Maybe they got them at a roadside stop and they drive in 3 brand new SUVs and a caravan. So they seize the SUVs. The guys are out on bond. They're not coming back. Now the county or the criminal jurisdiction institutes a civil forfeiture, takes the SUVs, paints them brown. Now they're county vehicles for the county police to use. So when you've got someone involved in a criminal enterprise, you can seize their, and if the property is used in the criminal enterprise, you can seize their cash, you can seize their car, you can seize their house, you can seize their airplanes, and then you can institute a forfeiture procedure where you cut off their rights of ownership, and the property literally goes to the governmental entity.
And I just want to add the problem is that on a more granular level, it's the police are seizing assets from individuals that may or may not be guilty of something, and they're taking their cars. You maybe get stopped, you've got marijuana, then all of a sudden you've lost your car, so it on a more it affects, it doesn't affect just sort of, and a lot of money. It affects a lot of poor people too, that are wrongly involved in the criminal justice system.
Wow.
And that's another one of those instances where the prosecutor has a substantial amount of discretion on whether to charge, whether not to charge, whether to seek a civil forfeiture or not. There are 3 people in the car, and the guy on the passenger side in the rear has got marijuana on the seat between him and the other guy, but the car belongs to the driver. So is the local DA going to institute a forfeiture procedure and take the car when, it's more reasonable to assume that the marijuana didn't belong to him, it belonged to one of those guys in the back seat, but they're going to take the driver's car, and the driver says, I didn't even know they had it. So there's a lot of discretion there. And that's why I constantly say you got to have good people in these positions.
Yeah, I didn't even know any of this, so that's really enlightening.
Well, you've never seen the sausage being made.
That's right. I haven't. Well, we're gonna. We have one last question, which is for Dr. Salam, and we have so many thank yous. First of all, to Dr. Salam, to you for being here, for your voice, for just embodying forgiveness and resilience. And it's just so inspiring to all of us. But the question is, Dr. Salam, I'm sure that there are times that you get frustrated with how slowly change is happening in the criminal justice reform space. What motivates you to keep moving forward and keep fighting the good fight?
So I think what motivates me is knowing that we're fighting on a good side, like we're fighting for a just cause, right? If we didn't do what we are supposed to do, what we have been created to do, then evil would win. And I think about it from the perspective, and I may have said this earlier, but we're fighting really against spiritual wickedness in high and low places. I had the awesome opportunity to really embody the words of Dr. Maya Angelou when she talked about you should be angry, but you must not be bitter. And I thought about what is the difference between being angry and bitter, right? Angry shows up when you say things to yourself like, you know what, I had enough. I keep eating sugar. I'm not supposed to eat sugar. It's gonna be a health problem. I must just stop eating sugar, right? And so in your anger, you do something about it. And so what Dr. Maya Angelou is saying You should be angry, but you must not be bitter. And then she says, bitterness is like a cancer. It eats upon the host. It doesn't do anything to the object of its displeasure. And then she teaches us how to become alchemists. She says, use that anger. You dance it. You march it. You vote it. You do everything about it. And then she said, you talk it. Never stop talking it. I think the glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel is something that I've always hoped for, especially being in prison. I had to project myself into that future in order to be able to live there, even if it was just for a moment. Because in those moments, it allowed my body to be free, even though because it allowed my mind to be free, even though my body was in bondage, it allowed my body to be free, because wherever your mind goes, your body follows. And so the hope that I have is knowing that this is not for nothing. The hope that I have is knowing that people who don't look like me, who've been using their privilege to help and to effectuate change, they got their foot in the door and they're holding the door open, right? My late great attorney, William Kunstler, he said his daughters told me that he used to tell his daughters, all white people are racist. And his daughters were shocked. Dad, what are you talking about? You know, you fight for people, you fight the good fight. Like, how could you say all white people are racist? And he said, it has nothing to do with the color of your skin, but it has everything to do with what happens when you go through the door and the pass that you're given because of the color of your skin. And so inside, you could be a person who is for true justice, freedom, and equality, wants the best for all of us, right? But because of the color of your skin, no one is going to ask anything of you when you come through. They're going to assume that you're supposed to be there. And the beautiful thing about that is that those individuals who know, they can open the door, leave the door open, and tell people to bring in their chairs like Shirley Chisholm to sit at the table. Or they could be like Ava DuVernay and say, hey, listen, why go to that table? We can create our own. And so I know that living in a future state of Afrofuturism teaches us that we can make it, teaches us that at some point in the future, we will be exactly where we are supposed to be. And that future may be right now. All we have to do is lean in, right? All we have to do is lean in, because like I said, I used to say reform. Now I'm talking about abolition. But I'm not talking about abolition in the context of us living lawlessly, us not having an institution, a system that we create. I'm talking about us creating a system, having institutions that allow for the inclusion of the kaleidoscope of the human family to live full. And as my good friend Les Brown always says, and die empty. Give everything that you're supposed to give to this world, so that when death comes for you, it'll find you climbing up a new mountain and not sliding down an old one. It's about that.
I love that. And that is we're right a minute away from our stopping time, although this conversation I'm sure could go on forever. I know we're just scratching the surface. So I have more questions. Some of them are a little more detailed. So what I can say is that I'm sure that Lisa, Hill, the speakers wouldn't mind maybe talking about some of these policy things. I also want to go ahead and give the CLE code for the attorneys who need the credit. It is SS7749. And speaking of CLEs and learning more, some of the questions that came in are really they are the next step. What can we do? How can we learn more? What can we learn about which issues do we need to know about? How do we educate ourselves? Obviously, CLE is a good way. And I think, we should have a call to action now. We need to have these conversations. We need to educate ourselves more. Lisa is with the Georgia Justice Project, and I know that they, on their website, have many resources about legislation. Oh, and sorry, just to say, it was SS as in salam, not FF for the CLE code. And so we encourage you to go onto the Georgia Justice Project website to check out things that are happening locally. Ogletree also works a lot with the Equal Justice Initiative. That's also a good site to check out about things that are going on nationally. And there's also the Southern Center for Human Rights, which does a lot of work in criminal justice reform. We will send out information about these organizations, just their websites, so that attendees can have them. And just to repeat the code, again, it's SS as in salam, 7749. And so on that note, Dr. Salam, thank you so much for everything that you have shared with us today. We appreciate it. We appreciate your time, and most importantly, appreciate your voice. You are really such a wonderful voice for the needs of this country, and you embody, we want this country to be its best. We want our institutions to be their best, and we appreciate the work that you're doing for that. Lisa and Hill, thank you for bringing your voices. Thank you for the wealth of experience that you've shared with us today. And thank you to the Belonging Project, to Safarth, and to Ogletree also for hosting this. And thank you to everyone who joined. So we hope you enjoyed this webinar. We hope to see you at the next Belonging Project event, which will be taking place in March.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen.
Share.
Good day, you all. Good day, doctor.
Thank you.